everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Hybrid Healing Hour. Today, we have our first returning guest, Elyse Marrone, and I'm so excited to have you on as I loved our first podcast with you on gut health, and I've had a lot of people talk about how phenomenal it was and enjoyed listening. So if you haven't listened to it, please go back and listen to that one. But why don't you go ahead and reintroduce yourself to our audience today and tell us about a little bit about your background.
Awesome. Thanks, Deanna. Thanks for having me, first of all. So I am a registered dietitian. I practice in a functional integrative space, so a little different than your traditional trained dietitians. I've done some advanced training, so I really focus on really the gut, because we know most things do start in the gut and maybe everything. And then I look at why patients are having the symptoms and the blood work and what's going on with them. Why is that happening? And then addressing the root cause of that versus just saying, well, okay, so you're having some kind of an issue with your reflux or something like that. We can give you a pill for that, or you can take some Tums for that. So we really want to dig in and see why these patients are having the symptoms they're having. So that's just how we differ a little bit. Perfect.
And you also dabble in the nutraceutical environment.
I do, yes. I'm a consultant for a professional company, and I've helped with formulation of some programs for them. We've done some intermittent fasting kits, which is great. We'll be talking about intermittent fasting, which I'm super passionate about. And I'm also pretty much interested in doing more and more education on what's going on with food, with the allergy reactions and the sensitivities to foods, because we're seeing more and more of that as our environment becomes less acceptable to the human body, I think.
Right.
So that's a podcast for another day, though.
And that's testing, looking at the leaky gut syndrome, basically.
Looking at the gut lining to see if the size of the permeability is too large, and that would be letting things through that your body starts reacting to, and that stimulate the immune system. 80% of the immune system is actually in the gut, in the mucoid and gut-associated lymphoid tissue. So we do want to keep an eye on that, but most people aren't testing for those things, or they're not testing properly.
Right.
And
so today is about fasting, and we have been doing this in our clinic pretty much, I think, since 2019.
Yeah, the thing with medicine, especially with functional medicine and integrative medicine, is that there's a time period where something new comes out and everyone jumps on the bandwagon and everyone says this is the greatest thing ever. And then after a couple of years of it, then people go the other way and start nitpicking and finding problems with it. Now I think that's where we are with fasting. We're at the point where people are kind of nitpicking and saying that it's not good for you and it's bad for you. And they're pulling up all these articles about how it is not the best way to do things. And so, you have to use common sense. And that's why we want to do this podcast, is to put some common sense into what we do with fasting.
Absolutely. It's really not that new, though. I get that it's maybe new in the media and new in the integrated space. It is, but I mean, this goes way back, right? To, BC, when, religions have been doing this for many, many years. And there's studies that are wrapped around the religion that show benefit even with just a 12-hour fast.
Right.
So to say that there's no benefit, or to argue that, I think is short-sighted.
Yep.
If you're really looking at the research and you're going deep into it, there's absolutely no way you can say there's no benefit to fasting.
And I tell my patients, there's not one religion out there that does not have fasting built into it somewhere. Every religion has fasting as an aspect somewhere.
It's interesting. And fasting is really the only way that you can lower glucose and insulin at the same time. So there's no medicine that can do that.
Yep. So the hallmark we use in our practice is that when you eat can be as important as what you eat. And most people just look at what they're putting in their mouth.
Yeah, that's true. And, when I was in school and doing my internship, we were learning that, we want to keep people eating throughout the day. Breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Remember? I mean, wasn't that long ago, 2015, that was government guidelines. And that's no longer in the government guidelines. And if you look at the studies that really promoted that, they were funded by those companies that make breakfast foods.
I think it was Kellogg's. Yes.
Post.
Or Post, yes.
So
I know, it's amazing.
We've looking at our environment and looking at the American population, that has not worked in our favor. We are fatter now than we've ever been. 40% of our country adults are obese, so a BMI of over 30. And our children, about 20% of our children are obese. So eating breakfast maybe is not the best way to do this. And when you look at the benefits of fasting, one of the benefits is that over the day, you take in less calories just naturally without even trying. So it's not just about calories in, calories out, but there is some benefit in reducing the amount of calories that you're taking in.
And people have a misconception that fasting makes you hypoglycemic. It really doesn't, because your body has built-in mechanisms. Your liver will make sugar when you need it. So I tell people, if you are on a desert island, all you have is water and no food, chances are your blood sugar is not going to fluctuate very much over the 2 or 3 weeks that you have no food.
Absolutely. I mean, our bodies are meant to be in a fasted state, and we're meant to perform well in that state. If you look at how we evolved, we did not eat 5 times a day. We probably didn't eat every day because it depended where we were, what we could hunt if we were able to kill something, or if we were in a place where there was plentiful of plants, what we could gather. So we're meant to fast. We have the mechanisms in place. We have stored sugar in our liver and our muscle tissue in the form of glycogen that we can access. And for most people, they probably have enough glycogen to last them 20, 24 hours.
Right.
So fasting for, an intermittent fast or a fast of 24 hours, pretty much everybody should be able to do that. And the more you do it, the more flexible your body becomes in being able to access the stored, not just the sugar, the glycogen and glucose, but also your fatty acids and your fat tissue, which again, 40% of Americans have way too much of that.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And so why don't you go ahead and tell our audience, what is fasting?
So the definition of fasting is basically just abstaining from food and or water. We don't really recommend dry fasting just because there can be some other issues that come along with that, and it's not really necessary to get the major benefit of fasting. But fasting is really just abstaining from food. Now, we've gone forward and we've created these programs. So we have now what we call intermittent fasting or time-restricted eating. And all that means is that you have a window of when you're going to be eating and a window of when you're going to be fasting. So there's 3 really popular fasting protocols, I guess. There's the 16-8, where you fast for 16 hours and you eat for 8 hours. So that would be your time restriction of 16 hours. There's the 5-2, which is 2 days out of the week, you're eating very low calorie, maybe 500 calories a day. And the other 5 days, you're eating your normal diet. And then they have alternate day, where you fast one day or eat lower calories that one day, and then the next day you eat as you normally would. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. I think the major thing we need to look at is, if you're going to do it, you really do have to hit that at least 12 hours, probably more likely 14 to 16 hours, because the major benefit of fasting is going into a biochemical state called autophagy. And when you're in autophagy, which again is probably not happening until 14 to 16 hours, that's when your body says, you know what, we're really running out of our stored nutrition and our stored energy sources. What can we afford to give up? What can we scavenge and break down and make into energy that we don't need? And that's really where the magic happens, because that's when the body says, okay, well, here's a funky looking virus. We don't need that. Let's break it down. We're going to utilize the components of it, and we're going to make glucose from the amino acids of that through gluconeogenesis, which is how your body can actually take amino acids, which come from proteins, and make it into sugar. It can also help with pathogenic. So if you have maybe there is some kind of a parasite, it will help to attack that. Precancerous cells, any funky cells, broken down cells, weak cells, that's where your immune system goes to break that down, utilizing this process called autophagy, where you're saying, well, this is garbage. We don't want this out of our system. I mean, we don't want this in our system. So we break it down and we can recycle it and use it for something that's helpful. And,
Right.
You're never going to get there if you're always eating breakfast and then eating every 2.5 to 3 hours and having a snack and, not getting into that state.
And half the people out there are feeding themselves sugar, which creates more of those terrible cells.
Exactly. Sugar, we know, is an inflammatory molecule.
Right.
So,
And just to be clear, fasting is not just solid food, it's liquid too. So some people drink calories.
Right.
Any caloric intake will
it's
affect
calories,
fasting.
right? So I guess we should say that fasting is abstaining from intake of any calories. So when we do fast, there's actually some things that help promote autophagy, like their fasting mimetics. And one of those, thank the Lord, is coffee. Mm-hmm. So the polyphenols in coffee and tea, not with sugar in it, but just the coffee and tea in and of itself, can help to increase autophagy. So, you want to stay hydrated. So water, seltzer water, those things are, allowed during your fasting period. And then when you break the fast and start your feasting period, then you're allowed to take in the calories, whether you're eating them or drinking them.
So on that note, I get asked this question a lot because most people out there don't drink black coffee or black tea. So what are your thoughts about adding stevia or monk fruit to their beverage?
That's really controversial right now because what some people have done is using the glucose monitors. They wear the continuous glucose monitors. Some people actually, when they take stevia or monk fruit or even artificial sweeteners, God forbid, but when they do take those in, it does actually cause an increase in their blood sugar. Anytime you have an increase in blood sugar, your insulin hopefully will rise and then it will lower it.
Which therefore takes you out of the fasting state.
It's probably pulling you out of autophagy.
Okay.
Probably. Yeah.
And we're big fans of the continuous glucose monitoring. We've talked about it on other podcasts. We strongly recommend if you have access to, or if you have a doctor who will write you a prescription for one, it's great to use, especially in the beginning when you're first starting fasting.
Absolutely, because then you're not, you may not feel 100% sometimes as your body's adjusting to having the fasted state. And you say, well, I feel like I have low blood sugar. And then you measure it and it's like, well, no, it's in the 80s. I'm totally fine. Right. So it's good to have access to that without having to prick your finger every single time. Yeah,
I think it's definitely a good reassurance. But let's remind our audience that just because your sugars may not go up with something you eat, it may not necessarily mean that you're still in autophagy.
Right. So remember, autophagy happens when there's nothing coming in that the body can use. So it has to self-consume. And actually, That's what autophagy means, self-eating. So if you're taking in fat, right? So MCT is a very popular, like they put it in their coffee. And that will help to stimulate ketosis, which is another podcast, but it's not necessarily going to allow you to stay in autophagy because your body's then going to say, well, don't really need to break down these viruses or these funky cells or broken down DNA. We can use the MCT, which is actually kind of absorbed very easily into the mitochondria to be utilized as energy. So it's going to, if not slow it down, or stop it, it's not going to help increase that process. So
would you briefly be able to explain the difference then, and without going into a whole nother podcast, like you said, about autophagy versus ketosis? Because I think that's a confusion because I do put the MCT oil in my coffee as well. So there's a chance that I'm getting taken out of autophagy.
You're not fasting if you're putting MCT oil.
Okay. Yeah. And so that's where I thought with your body utilizing its resources that it can convert protein to carbs and glucose, right, for energy. But I didn't think it would do that with the fat. So I thought the MCT oil was fine.
But you're going into ketosis where your body is converting the fat into ketones.
Gotcha.
So then you're burning ketones. You're not going into autophagy where the immune system starts to look for...
like yourself.
Exactly.
Right.
Funky, potentially pathogenic cells that it can afford to sacrifice in order to keep the organism, you, in this case, in survival mode. So
Gotcha. And so why don't we go ahead and talk about those benefits? As you've already touched on, it clearly can boost your immune system.
It does, yes.
Why don't you tell our audience more? Because this is...
I think fasting really, if we go from head to toe, it really helps with every single organ in the body. So let's start with the brain. It does increase, and this has been studied to show an increase in brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is a factor that helps the body to make new brain cells. So who doesn't want that? I mean, with looking at what's going on in our, dementia, which is, now we're saying, well, that's really type 3 diabetes, but we're seeing a lot of dementia. We're seeing a lot of more of these neurological diseases. So I think fasting is going to be shown to be really super helpful in that case. It does help to increase your body's own stem cell production. So it helps your body to replace things that are lacking.
Is that why you think people improve with their inflammation and body aches, even joint pain can improve?
Absolutely. But even more directly, autophagy does decrease inflammatory markers like IL-6.
And other cytokines, yeah.
So you are just going to be less inflamed.
Great.
And many people have this misconception that fasting is just for weight loss, and it's really not. We have people who are normal weight, and some people who are underweight, who we still put on a fasting program for different benefits.
Absolutely. Fasting does so much more than weight loss. And I mean, it does help with weight loss, but not necessarily. Yeah. I mean, there's plenty of people who fast and then they just consume what they need for their basal metabolic rate plus their activity factor during their eating window. They're not going to lose weight, but they probably will gain muscle because another benefit of being in autophagy is it increases growth hormone. Exactly. So,
and then return can also increase testosterone.
Yes, absolutely.
And we've seen that in our practice.
Yes.
We've seen people naturally increase their testosterone levels by just adding fasting.
Yeah, fasting is amazing for doing that. So, and they've even shown in studies where if somebody eats the same amount of calories on a calorie restriction, so they're eating, their BMR or below, they will show that even though they are eating the same amount of calories, the group that's fasting doesn't lose as much lean tissue. So when you lose weight, you're going to see a loss of some lean tissue usually. So fasting will help to maintain your lean tissue.
I've actually read in another study that they describe it as a good stress. So when you fast, you actually are stressing your body, but in a good way. And then when you come out of the fasting, it actually stimulates your body to react more in a positive manner to rebuild that muscle even more.
Exactly. So you're fasting, which is, again, like you said, it is a good stress. Part of it is that you're not putting in anything inflammatory. If you think about how people eat, just getting them off of some of these inflammatory food-like substances and hyperpalatable foods, that in and of itself is going to remove the inflammation. But then you're putting your cells in a place where they're looking to make the most of what they have. So then during your eating window, when you're now putting back the amino acids from the proteins that you're eating and the fatty acids and even some of the carbohydrates, your body's saying, oh, okay, now we need to replete. So let's go ahead and, build up the lean tissue, and having the growth hormone go up really helps for your ability to do that too.
Well, we know growth hormone because we use growth hormone analogs in our practice, and we see the recovery, the repair that it can help with even in workouts. You're not sore the next day. It can help with sleep. You sleep better. So it's just, and the cognition actually, I think, is improved with the growth hormone as well. So there, like you said, there's so many benefits. We know that it can help reduce anybody has diabetes or pre-diabetes even, right? Even just the metabolic syndrome in the waist, the circumference, and any cardiovascular risk reduction. I mean,
oh, absolutely. When you're fasting, you see triglycerides will go way down. You see, the majority of weight that's lost is waist circumference. So you'll see a decrease in that by like 4 to 7% in patients who are fasting.
So let's talk about cardiovascular risk, because there was a study that came out in JAMA in April of 2024 that said that fasting has been found to increase cardiovascular risk and increase cardiovascular death. And all three of us have looked at that article, and we find it to be extremely flawed. Right? Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. And, I read it and I said, I wonder why they even published this, because they didn't give us a lot of information. We don't know. I think it was 20,000 people that answered a questionnaire.
Yeah, survey, not even an actual study.
So a survey.
And it was based off of memory, the quote unquote, their memory.
Which if you can try and tell me what you ate yesterday for breakfast, or you probably didn't eat
Right.
breakfast, but okay,
Right.
tell me what you ate yesterday for lunch. A lot of people couldn't remember that. But what was interesting too is we don't know where they found these people. Like where were these 20,000 people? Were they in a nursing home? Were they already hospitalized? It wasn't a well done study. And it's unfortunate that it was published and it was published in JAMA, which is really disappointing.
It's kind of surprising.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyone who has concerns about that article, I just don't find it to be something that we are worried about.
Right.
We can probably come up with about 1,000 articles that will disprove what
exactly.
that article was saying, that are much better done, even in an animal study.
Right.
Which isn't, we want human studies to compare to humans, but a human survey is not really a scientific model.
No.
So
I want to talk about, as you've already touched on, intermittent fasting is more of the 24-hour fasting, right?
Well, intermittent fasting is really any time that you've decided you're going to intermittent fast. So you can, we call intermittent fasting like any time frame. So it could be the 16 hours, it could be the 12 hours. 12 hours is an intermittent fast. So that's really, just abstaining from calories.
So the 5-2 ratio that you said, I always thought of that as doing like 5 days eat regular, but 2 days during the week you do a 24-hour fast. But you're saying it's just actually even just reduced caloric intake.
Either way. Yeah.
Okay.
Everybody kind of has their own spin on it. And you know what? You can be super flexible with this fasting because every day can be different. Some days you may wake up and say, you know what? I ate dinner at 6:00 and it's 8:00 in the morning and I'm hungry. I'm going to eat. I usually don't eat until, 1:00 and I eat from 1 to 7. But as you get more and more adapted and with metabolic flexibility, your body's going to kind of let you know. Like there's going to be times when you're like, I'm usually not hungry now, but I am today. So maybe you worked out that day. Or maybe you're fighting something and your body's utilizing energy and you actually do need to eat.
That's the beauty of fasting, is because everyone can do it differently. Everyone can do it their own way. I found in my own personal experience with my patients that men seem to have an easier time doing the time-restricted eating than women do. But women tend to stick with it longer than men do. Men a lot of times can be affected by external factors like going out to dinners, spending time with their friends. And so you adjust it. So if one way is not working for you, try a different way.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I think it's recommended, from what I've read in the past, is, we were hunters and gatherers. So we only were able to find food during daylight hours. And so it's definitely recommended to try to eat within the daylight hours. Right. But I agree. I mean, started doing this because I was eating crap for breakfast. I realized I was stopping by Starbucks, getting a sugary coffee, and I was getting like whatever breakfast sandwich they had, or even Dunkin'. And when I started fasting, I was like, well, let me cut out the worst meal. And I did that. I went to black coffee immediately, skipped breakfast, and I drank a ton more water then because I wasn't eating, right? And I immediately, it was really hard. Don't get me wrong. I'm a ravenous human being when I wake up. So, but it definitely impacted my life, and I can see the results. It took a while because I was so hungry I couldn't focus, but then I do feel it helped my attention, and I was able to focus better. I had better cognition. I felt sharper, and I wasn't bogged down. I used to never think that I would be able to fast because I would, after breakfast, right? So right before lunch. So if I had breakfast at 8, then at lunch we eat at 12:30, right? I'd get these shakes, right? And I was like, oh my God, I'll never be able to fast because I shake. Believe it or not, and I tell this to every single person, I stopped shaking. When you don't eat the sugar, I was crashing.
Right.
And I didn't know that because here I thought I was having eggs for breakfast. But it was the crap I had in my coffee. So you have to think about all of these aspects. It's whatever you're putting in your body. And so now I've totally changed my lifestyle. I don't do that anymore. And I feel great. And I can go and eat at 2:00 and I never get the shake. And that's why I love the term, what you said already, metabolically flex. That is the key term that when people tell me I can't fast, that means you need to even more. That means you are not metabolically flex and you need to work towards that. So, I mean, there's definitely different protocols. Take it little by little. And that's where I like working your way up to it. So if you can start with a 12-hour, so you sleep 8 of those hours, hopefully you are. But, if you can only eat between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m., that's a good start. And if you have to do 7 to 8 or whatever, that's fine. But then we can gradually increase that range and go from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Then you choose, do you want to go up an hour or back an hour? So you can do 9 a.m. to 8 p.m., then 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. And then I go up, 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. So I like working gradually at that and going at your pace, because I still believe something is better than nothing.
Absolutely.
Giving your gut rest.
Yeah. Every patient's going to be different. You have those patients, same as I do, where they're like, okay, you said not to eat for, 16 hours. So I'm not going to eat for 2 days. It's like, no, that's not really where I want you to go. So, but then you have the other ones like, oh, I can't. And you're right. If they're not able to go without a meal and not be shaky, not feel anxious, then they're definitely not metabolically flexible. We're supposed to be able to access our stored energy. That's how we evolved. Otherwise, we would never have made it to this point. So, and the circadian rhythm is definitely, so during the waking hours, you do actually have better sensitivity to insulin during that time. There is, our bodies are biologically more geared to digestion during the sunlight hours. So I agree if you can do that, but a lot of people will not give up having that dinner. So a lot of times will just say, fine, you just give up breakfast. You don't have to give up dinner. But ideally, you eat breakfast and you eat lunch and you don't eat anything after that. That would be a better phase to do it. But I think your compliance is going to go way down.
It does. And I thought about that, but I personally couldn't even arrange that with my schedule. And so I know we gear it towards our social life, but I still feel like there's a lot of benefits and it still works.
It absolutely is. You're still getting the benefits.
So are there any downfalls to fasting?
There are certain people who really should not be fasting. So for sure, if you are pregnant or breastfeeding, if you have an eating disorder, probably not going to start that patient on any kind of fasting.
Insulin-dependent diabetics probably.
Insulin-dependent diabetics, yeah. I mean, you can fast them. You just have to adjust their insulin. And there will be benefits for that.
Well, what I meant is that they should not be doing it without supervision.
Absolutely not.
They need to be under a doctor's supervision when they do it. These are the people you have to be cautious with.
Absolutely. Yes, for sure. But other than that, I mean, I think fasting is going to benefit pretty much everyone, and anybody can do a 12-hour fast. So if, you just start with that, that's a great start. And again, there's been studies looking at, Ramadan, which is a 12-hour fast pretty much, and showing the benefit in cardiovascular risk factors, as well as inflammation markers are the two measurements they all improve.
One thing I want to point out, I have people, they're like, oh yeah, I fast. I eat breakfast, I skip lunch, and then I eat dinner late. And I'm like, okay, well, are you eating at 9 p.m. at night and 7 a.m. in the morning? Then that could be your window, I guess. But can you explain that is not the same?
So even if that was their window, it would be, okay, you are fasting, but you want 3 hours from the time that you finish your last meal till you put your head on that pillow to go to sleep. Otherwise, it's going to affect your sleep and your cortisol levels, and your blood sugar is going to be too high when you go to sleep. So,
and your heart rate's high. I mean, by me wearing the Oura Ring, I know, like, when I eat a late meal and I don't give myself that 3 hours before bed, if it's like under 2, my heart rate stays high for the whole night. And the next morning it says, are you okay?
Horrible, right? Yes, exactly. So you really need that consecutive time frame to not be eating of a minimum of 12 hours. I like 16 to 18 hours. Maybe like once a week you could do a 24-hour, which is just dinner to dinner the next day. I've had patients do as long as a 72-hour fast, because if they're going to be getting like a stem cell injection, 72 hours is when you really start to push you making your own stem cells. But after 72 hours, there's detrimental effects for some people. First of all, metabolism will slow. So we've all heard, I have to eat, super frequently. Otherwise I'm going to go into starvation mode and I'm going to slow my metabolism. No, That doesn't happen until you get that 72 hours. Actually, your metabolism increases initially with fasting because you're pushing epinephrine and norepinephrine, and that will increase metabolism up to 24%.
Hence the good stress.
Exactly. But after 72 hours, it's not like some is good, more is better. After 72 hours, you're really, your T3 or your thyroid starts to stop producing as much hormone. So, and there's other things that could, more lean tissue is going to get broken down. So I like from, I would say, a minimum of 12 to a maximum of 72 hours for fasting, drinking lots of water, staying super hydrated. You can have your black coffee, you can have your black tea, and you will get the benefits of the autophagy, which is really where we want to take the body.
And fasting doesn't start when you finish your last meal, because you still have food in your GI tract that's going to be there for a little while. And people who are on GLP-1 medications, that food can be there even longer because of the delayed gastric emptying.
That's true. That's true. That is a little bit of a new side effect that, we didn't really think about that. And GLP-1s, have you done a podcast on those yet?
We have.
Okay.
A weight loss podcast, yes.
So, the biochemical effect of those in conjunction, they make it a lot easier to fast, but you probably do need a longer window to get into autophagy because you do have the food in the system longer.
Can you go ahead and touch on, there is a 5-day fasting mimicking diet. And as you mentioned, you don't like to fast water fast alone for longer than 72 hours. So can you talk about this Prolon? Yeah.
So the FMD or fasting mimicking diet was developed by a Dr. Walter Longo. And I think initially it was actually a way to have patients who are going through chemotherapy get the benefits of fasting, but without actually not eating. So this program is actually super low in proteins, 10% protein. It's all plant protein, so any protein that is there. So mostly carbohydrate and fat. So the thought is that you're eating, but you're still getting the benefits of fasting, which you probably do to some, but I don't think you're going to get fully into autophagy where you're always, because they're not giving you a window. So you can start eating in the morning, and as long as you only eat what's in that box, the calorie restriction, which is 800 calories for the first day and then I think 1,100 for the next 4 days, you are in that fasting mimicking state. So maybe your body's not upregulating the inflammatory markers or mTOR, which is the major marker of aging, and that's really what focusing on just plant proteins will restrict. But I don't think you're going to be getting that anti-cancer, the increase in growth hormone like you get with pure, true fasting and autophagy. But the studies show really good for cardiovascular disease. You do 3 consecutive months of 5 days of this kit, and you do see benefit in reducing cardiovascular risk factors.
And it's good for weight loss too.
Some people will lose the weight. A lot of it depends on what are they doing for the other 25 days of the month.
Right. I know they say you can go right back to your normal diet.
Right.
I'm like, oh, okay, well, let's take that with a grain of salt, right?
Yeah,
because if we go to the Americanized diet, you're not going to benefit yourself whatsoever.
Right.
Yeah, I still would recommend.
There may be still a benefit of having 5 days where you're actually in that biochemical state, but then those other 25 days will probably offset some of the benefits.
Right. So you could still go back to a clean diet,
Modified Mediterranean, preferably gluten-free.
Right.
Yep.
But Prolon's not the only one out there. There's others.
There are actually. I developed one that was similar to Prolon in that it's isocaloric to Prolon, but it's not as low in protein. I tried to do Prolon. I can fast, no problem. 72 hours, no problem. I do it once a quarter. When I was doing Prolon, I actually was extremely hungry and anxious, and I felt like my adrenals were very stressed. I could tell my cortisol was very high. And the third day, I couldn't sleep because I was so hungry. And that never happens to me when I eat nothing. So, looking at the differences, I said, well, if I had more protein, I probably would have been okay. So I did another similar program, but instead of restricting my protein to 10%, my protein was probably closer to 50%. And I actually did fine on that. And if you look at measuring lean tissue, for, a 5-day period, you're probably not going to, you do see a little bit of a loss in both because you're restricting calories, but I felt so much better having the protein. So it really kind of depends, but you're still, the fasting mimicking, if the benefit is that calorie restriction, you're still getting the same calorie restriction with it's called the 5-day IFD or intermittent fasting diet kit. So it's a little bit different.
And yours involves MCT oil in that, right?
There is MCT oil. We use a vegan protein and some greens, like a green drink, to make sure that you're getting all of the antioxidant support and then you're only doing that in your eating window. So, utilizing the MCT oil helps a lot with satiety. MCT is really a very interesting molecule. So it's medium chain triglyceride, that's MCT is, and it's absorbed differently than if you eat regular fat or long chain fatty acids. So when you eat long chain fatty acids, you need the enzyme lipase. You have to make the fat into a micelle so it can get through the cell membrane and be utilized for energy, and you need carnitine for that. And it's a process. With MCT, you don't need any of that. It can get absorbed right in the gut through the villi that are there, kind of looking for food, and goes right into the mitochondria, into the Krebs cycle, and it's just used for energy. So utilizing that does help a lot with the hunger, which you will experience on Prolon, or at least I know I did. And I've had other patients that have said the same thing. Also, I think if you're lean already, reducing the amount of protein that you're taking in is going to be harder. So if you have an obese patient population, they're probably going to do a lot better with a lower protein. Right. They have more access to other things that they can utilize, like glycogen, probably more glycogen and more fat.
Right. And is there any way to check for autophagy? I think that's the question I get asked.
There's really not. I mean, we look at blood sugar, right? So, but if your blood sugar goes up, it doesn't necessarily mean that 100% you're out of autophagy. We don't really know that for sure. And again, some people their blood sugar goes up because they have taste of something that's sweet, even though there's no calories to it. So if you have stevia, there's no calories, but your brain is triggering this blood sugar reaction because it tastes something sweet, which then releases insulin, and you need insulin to store fat. That's so we really don't want high insulin. We want our insulin to stay low because that will allow us to more access fat for fuel.
Interesting. I cannot think of any other questions. I think this has been so informative. I love having you on always.
Thank you.
And
I think we have many more topics to talk about in the future with you.
Would you be able to tell our audience how they would be able to reach you?
Sure. You can reach me through email, which is info@thenutritioninstitute.org, or my website is thenutritioninstitute.org. And my phone is 561-252-7857.
Thank you so much, Elyse.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
The information contained in this podcast is provided for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended for the purposes of diagnosing, curing, treating, or preventing any disease. This podcast is provided on the understanding that it does not constitute medical or other professional advice or services. Before using any products or services referenced on this podcast, consult with your healthcare provider, carefully read all labels, and heed all directions and cautions that accompany the products. Information found or received through the podcast should not be used in place of a consultation or advice from a healthcare provider. If you suspect you have a medical problem or should you have any healthcare questions, please promptly call or see your healthcare provider. This podcast, including Dr. Brian Marias, Deanna Weilbacher, and Hybrid Medical Solution, do not claim responsibility for any adverse effects from the use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for any statements made by the guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements and advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referenced.
If you would like to submit any questions or if you have any topics you would be interested in hearing about on future episodes, please contact us through our website, www.hybridmedicalsolution.com. That is solution with no S at the end. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook, all under Hybrid Medical Solution.